Hello and welcome. I am glad you are here, and if you enjoy long, immersive history stories that unfold slowly and fully, consider subscribing or following so you do not miss the next deep dive. Now, let us begin our long journey together, a journey across centuries and oceans, into the shadows behind one of the most celebrated and misunderstood periods in human history. This is the dark truth behind the age of exploration. When most people hear that phrase, they picture gleaming ships sailing across calm blue waters, courageous explorers gripping weathered ropes, and dramatic discoveries that changed the world. The story is often told as a tale of bravery, curiosity, and progress, a moment when Europe looked beyond its borders and stepped boldly into the unknown. But behind that romantic image lies a much heavier reality, a reality built on suffering, conquest, profit, and the collision of worlds that would reshape the human story forever. As we move through this long narrative, we will peel back the layers of myth and take a slow, deliberate walk through the world as it was before the voyages began, and then through the events that followed, not as legends carved in marble, but as lived moments full of conflict, ambition, and irreversible consequences. To understand why the age of exploration unfolded the way it did, we must first imagine Europe in the generations leading up to those first expansive voyages. It was not a place overflowing with opportunity or stability. Instead, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities that were often hungry, deeply divided, and constantly struggling for advantage. People lived with the memory of plague, with the echo of wars that had drained wealth and lives, and with the growing sense that greatness was slipping away to other corners of the world. The bustling trade routes of the Islamic world, the wealth of African kingdoms, and the powerful empires of Asia overshadowed Europe's modest resources. Many in Europe felt boxed in. Surrounded by distant riches, they could not reach except through long and heavily controlled routes that passed through hands wealthier and stronger than their own. This frustration blended with a restlessness that had been growing for centuries. The Crusades had exposed Europeans to distant lands, new goods, and unfamiliar ideas. Travelers returned home with stories of spices that transformed food, fabrics more luxurious than anything produced in Europe, and markets bursting with goods that seemed almost magical in their variety. Yet those same goods came with high prices, and the intermediaries who controlled the flow of trade were not eager to allow newcomers into their networks. This rising awareness of treasures just out of reach pushed European rulers to seek alternatives, and slowly, the idea took hold that the only way to gain true power and wealth was to find new routes that bypassed traditional barriers, routes that would allow them to shape the world on their own terms. Even before the first famous explorers set sail, Europe was changing in ways that made these ambitions possible. New technologies, some borrowed, some rediscovered, and some innovated, allowed ships to sail farther than before. Maps grew more detailed, navigation improved, and with each advancement, the dream of reaching distant lands grew less like a fantasy and more like a dangerous but achievable mission. Yet as these tools developed, so did the attitudes of the rulers who funded the voyages. Their motivations were not driven by curiosity alone. They wanted wealth, slaves, spices, gold, land, and power. They wanted to spread their faith, believing deeply that they had a divine right and duty to do so. And they wanted to outcompete rival kingdoms, believing that every new territory claimed meant another step toward dominance. But this is where the story begins to darken, because the moment these ambitions touched the shores of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they collided with millions of people who already had rich cultures, histories, and systems of life. These people were not waiting to be discovered. They were living full and complex lives. The age of exploration was not simply the story of Europeans exploring unknown lands. It was the story of expansion into lands already known, inhabited, and cherished by others. And as we will see, the encounters that followed were often marked not by mutual curiosity, but by violence, exploitation, and an unsparing hunger for control. Before those fateful encounters begin, let us linger a little longer in pre-voyage Europe, because understanding the mindset of those who set out on these journeys helps us understand the choices they made. Many young men who boarded these ships came from families with few prospects. They saw the voyages as a chance to escape poverty or obscurity. Others were soldiers without wars to fight, eager for new battlegrounds where glory or plunder could be found. Monarchs knew this and used their ambitions to fuel their own. They promised rewards, titles, and land, even though much of that land was already home to civilizations far older than their own kingdoms. And so the stage was set. A continent hungry for wealth, shaped by competition, armed with new technologies, and convinced of its own moral and religious superiority, was ready to burst outward into the wider world. But the moment those first ships pushed away from the docks, a long chain of events began that would transform every region they touched, often with tragedy that would echo for centuries. As Europe drifted into the late medieval period, the continent found itself pressed by forces that made life unpredictable and often harsh. Economies rose and fell with the rhythm of harvests, storms, and war. Many regions struggled with scarcity, not because the land was incapable of producing food, but because the systems meant to distribute it were fragile. A single failed crop could mean famine. A single war could disrupt years of trade. Ordinary people often found themselves caught in the tension between those who held power and those who needed it simply to survive. Local markets were small and limited, and for most, life revolved within the same few miles generation after generation. Ambition grew in these tight spaces, especially among nobles and merchants who dreamed of wealth that local conditions could not provide. At the same time, Europe was not unified. It was carved into kingdoms, duchies, and city-states that were constantly watching each other with suspicion. Every ruler feared falling behind a rival. Each victory or alliance made one kingdom stronger and another weaker. These rivalries created a hunger for advantage that could not be satisfied by what lay within their own borders. Rulers looked outward, searching for ways to gain more wealth, more prestige, and more influence. And in their minds, the world beyond Europe shimmered with possibilities that were growing more tempting each decade. The memories of the Crusades lingered strongly as well. Although the Crusades had ended long before the age of exploration truly began, they had changed the mindset of Europe. Thousands of Europeans had traveled to distant lands and returned with stories of bustling cities, vast markets, and cultures far richer and more complex than they had ever imagined. They brought back silk, spices, sugar, and countless other goods that seemed extraordinary compared to the ordinary materials of daily European life. Even those who had never traveled were influenced by these tales, hearing them retold in marketplaces, taverns, castles, and churches. The Crusades, though violent and driven by religious zeal, had also expanded European curiosity. People began to ask what else lay beyond the edges of their maps. This curiosity slowly sharpened into something more strategic. If such wealth existed elsewhere, then perhaps Europe could reach it directly. But that was only a distant dream at first, because the routes that connected Europe to the wider world were controlled by powers stronger and wealthier. Middle Eastern and North African empires dominated the flow of goods from Asia. Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, controlled much of the European end of Mediterranean trade. Portugal, Spain, England, and France had little access to these riches except through expensive intermediaries. Their rulers resented this dependence. They wanted direct access to wealth, especially the spices that preserved food, transformed meals, and were valued almost like gold. In the background, Europe's knowledge of the ocean was slowly improving. Sailors and scholars experimented with new ideas, new measurements, and new instruments. The compass made navigation more reliable than it had ever been. The astrolabe allowed sailors to calculate their position by the stars. Shipbuilders learned to design vessels that could handle longer journeys and unpredictable winds. These technological changes did not come all at once, but as they accumulated, each made the idea of exploring the open ocean a little less impossible. It is important to understand that even with these tools, the risk was still enormous. Many believed the sea hid monsters, or that sailors could reach a point where the water simply fell into nothingness. But fear did not stand a chance against ambition. Ambition was the true force behind what came next. European rulers wanted gold to strengthen their treasuries. They wanted spices to build trade empires. They wanted to spread their faith and believed deeply that doing so was a divine mission. They wanted land to claim, laborers to control, and new sources of power that would allow them to outmaneuver their rivals. The age of exploration did not begin because of a single reason, but because all these motivations intertwined, creating a pressure that demanded expansion. Every new piece of knowledge, every story from a returning traveler, every rumor of distant riches pushed Europe closer to the moment when its ships would sail beyond familiar waters and into worlds already full of people who could never have imagined what was coming. As Europe inched toward the 15th century, the continent found itself caught between limitations and possibilities, a place where ambition constantly pushed against the edges of knowledge. Even though most people lived their lives within a few miles of their birthplace, and even though cities were small compared to the great capitals of Asia or the wealthy hubs of Africa, there was a growing awareness that the world was far larger than the average European household could ever imagine. The whispers of distant markets filled with spices, cloth, ivory, precious stones, and metals worked their way through merchant networks and into the imaginations of rulers. Those rulers, often young and eager to leave a mark on history, felt a tightening pressure. If one kingdom found a route to these treasures, the others would be left behind forever. By this time, the Mediterranean trade routes had already shown Europe a glimpse of what lay beyond. But even those glimpses were filtered through intermediaries who controlled the flow of wealth. Arab traders, Ottoman merchants, North African navigators, and the great Italian maritime republics all had far more influence over long-distance commerce than the Western and Northern European kingdoms did. Goods that originated in India might pass through dozens of hands before they ever reached the markets of Lisbon, Seville, or London. By the time they did, their prices had ballooned beyond what the average merchant or noble could afford. This imbalance frustrated Europe deeply, especially its rising monarchies. They wanted freedom from middlemen. They wanted direct access to wealth. They wanted to reverse the hierarchy of power, yet wanting was not enough. They needed tools, knowledge, and courage powerful enough to break the limits of their world. It was during this period that changes in navigation began to accelerate. For centuries, sailors had hugged coastlines, navigating by sight, by memory, and by legends passed from master to apprentice. The sea was not a place of exploration, but a road for short travel between familiar ports. But gradually, a quiet revolution began to stir in the workshops of craftsmen, in the minds of scholars, and on the decks of merchant ships. Tools that had once been rare curiosities started to become more common. The magnetic compass, borrowed from earlier innovations in China and transmitted through the knowledge networks of the Islamic world, became an invaluable device for determining direction even when clouds hid the stars or when a ship drifted too far from land. Alongside the compass, the astrolabe grew in importance. This instrument, also shaped by centuries of development across the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern worlds, allowed sailors to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. With practice, this information could be used to estimate a ship's latitude. For the first time, European sailors could begin to understand their position with something better than guesswork. Still imperfect, still leaving wide margins for error, but significantly more accurate than anything they had before, the astrolabe became a symbol of a new kind of voyage, one based not on hugging the coast, but on venturing into the open sea. At the same time, shipbuilding changed dramatically. Europe had long relied on bulky, sturdy vessels designed for rivers and sheltered waters, but now shipwrights experimented with new shapes and sails. Influence flowed in from many regions. From the Arab world, Europeans adopted the lateen sail, a triangular sail that allowed ships to sail more effectively against the wind. By blending this with their own square sails, they created hybrid vessels like the caravel, which balanced speed and maneuverability in ways that earlier ships could not. Caravels were small enough to be agile but large enough to carry supplies for longer journeys. Their hull designs made them capable of crossing open ocean without breaking apart in heavy swells. They represented a turning point, the moment when ocean voyages became not only possible but increasingly practical. These technological shifts did not happen overnight, and they did not happen in isolation. They were the result of centuries of knowledge flowing across continents, carried by traders, scholars, religious pilgrims, and even through conflict. The age of exploration was never a purely European creation, though European monarchies would later try to claim it as their own. Instead, it was built on an accumulation of global ideas, refined and adapted in ways that would ultimately make Europe capable of expanding far beyond its shores. Yet as these tools came into European hands, the intentions behind their use grew sharper and often darker. To the rulers who funded these technological improvements and sponsored expeditions, these innovations were investments in future power. They imagined themselves as masters of new continents, owners of vast mines, controllers of spice markets, and leaders of global trade. Their dreams extended beyond simple commerce. They saw an opportunity to spread their beliefs across seas, to convert new populations, and to bring glory to their crowns by claiming lands none of their ancestors had touched. Religion, wealth, rivalry, pride, and fear all mixed together into a powerful force that pushed Europe toward the horizon. Motivations grew more complex as each generation passed. For many monarchs, the desire for gold was not just greed but a matter of survival. Running a kingdom was expensive. Wars drained treasuries. Palaces demanded upkeep. Nobles expected rewards. Armies expected pay. The promise of gold and silver from distant lands was like a lifeline. Spices, too, became symbols of wealth and luxury, but they were also practical necessities. Before the widespread use of refrigeration, spices helped preserve food, mask the taste of rot, and create dishes worthy of royal courts. They were so valuable that a handful of peppercorns could equal a worker's monthly wage. When rumors spread of islands overflowing with cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper, European rulers felt as though an entire world of untapped wealth was calling directly to them. Religious motivations were just as powerful. The Catholic Church held enormous influence over European politics, and many rulers believed that spreading Christianity to new populations would strengthen both their spiritual legacy and their political standing. Missionaries traveled alongside explorers, convinced that they were carrying salvation to the world. Some indeed believed they were doing good. Others saw conversion as a tool for control. European rulers convinced themselves that they had a divine mandate to expand, and this belief would justify actions that inflicted suffering on countless people. Above all, rivalry pushed Europe forward. Portugal did not want Spain to gain an advantage. Spain did not want England or France to overshadow them. Italy, divided into city-states, controlled Mediterranean trade but not the oceans. Each kingdom feared being left behind, and this fear created a race that would shape the world's future in ways none of them could have predicted. Technology, ambition, and desperation wove together into a tight rope that would stretch across continents, dragging millions of lives into its path. As these forces intertwined, Europe reached a point where the question was no longer whether exploration would happen, but who would lead the charge and how far they would go. The stage was almost set, and the first daring voyages were close at hand. But before the sails filled with wind and the ships turned toward the unknown, the people of Europe had already set into motion a chain of events that would forever alter the balance of global power. As the 15th century progressed, Portugal found itself in a unique position along the western edge of Europe, tucked against the vast Atlantic, facing a horizon that most people still regarded with deep uncertainty. Its coastline became a natural gateway to ambitions that had been growing for generations. The kingdom was smaller than many of its neighbors, and its resources were limited compared to the powerful realms of France or the sprawling territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet Portugal held an advantage that had little to do with size and everything to do with vision. Its rulers recognized earlier than most that the ocean was not merely a boundary, but a highway waiting to be understood. They saw the winds, the currents, and the tides not as dangers but as clues. And at a time when others hesitated, Portugal stepped forward. Central to this moment was Prince Henry, a figure who would become known to later generations as Prince Henry the Navigator. The title was not entirely accurate, for Henry himself was not a sailor, nor did he command voyages from the decks of ships. Instead, his influence came from his relentless support of exploration and his belief that Portugal's future lay beyond the familiar waters of Europe. Henry sponsored expeditions, funded the study of navigation, and gathered together mapmakers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and sailors at his court. Whether or not he founded a formal school is a matter of debate, but what he certainly did was create a space where knowledge flowed more freely than it had before. The people he assembled shared ideas, refined tools, and turned theories into practical techniques that would reshape the course of history. Under Henry's patronage, Portuguese ships began pushing farther south along the western coast of Africa. To many Europeans of the time, Africa was a land of mystery, spoken of in stories that mixed truth and myth until neither could be cleanly separated. The further south one traveled, the stranger the tales became. Some insisted that the heat near the equator was so unbearable that no human could survive under it. Others whispered of sea creatures that lurked near distant shores, ready to devour entire ships. And yet, voyage after voyage, these beliefs began to fracture as Portuguese sailors learned that the world was far more vast and varied than imagination had allowed. The early expeditions were cautious and short, often advancing only a little farther than the previous journey. Fear was an ever-present companion. Many sailors signed on only because they had few other options, fleeing poverty or punishment, or hopping for rewards that seemed barely more real than the legends they chased. The ships themselves, though sturdier than those of earlier centuries, remained vulnerable to storms that could rise out of nowhere and batter them with relentless force. Each voyage demanded bravery that bordered on desperation, yet each also yielded valuable information. New stretches of coastline were mapped, new currents were charted, new harbors and rivers were noted. Every detail recorded by pilots and scribes added to the growing body of knowledge that Portugal would use to push still farther into the Atlantic world. But behind the sails and the sea spray, darker motives guided the crown's expanding interests. Although Portugal publicly justified its explorations with language about virtue, discovery, and divine mission, its rulers were equally interested in wealth and control. Early contacts along the African coast were not innocent exchanges. At first, Portuguese sailors approached local communities cautiously, unsure of how they would be received. Some meetings were peaceful, involving trade of goods like metal tools or textiles for local products. But other encounters quickly turned violent as Portugal realized that power could be seized as well as negotiated. One of the most defining shifts of this early period came when the Portuguese turned their attention toward human beings as a source of profit. They began raiding coastal communities, capturing men, women, and children, and transporting them back to Portugal, where they were sold into slavery. These early raids were brutal and destabilizing, and though some failed miserably, ending in ambushes or resistance that forced the Portuguese to retreat, they also convinced the crown that enslaved labor could become a cornerstone of wealth. Over time, this practice shifted from chaotic raids to more systematic trade, as Portugal established fortified posts along the coast. These outposts became hubs where African captives were exchanged for European goods, often through local intermediaries who operated within complex regional politics. As Portugal's reach expanded, the coastline of West Africa transformed. African societies, some of them already powerful and interconnected through long-established trade networks, were pulled into a rapidly changing economic system. Some leaders attempted to negotiate with the Portuguese as equals, while others resisted or retreated inland. But the arrival of European ships carrying cannons, soldiers, and insatiable hunger for labor altered the balance of power. It marked the early foundations of what would become the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would devastate countless communities and shape the destiny of nations across multiple continents. Though these events were unfolding far from the courts of Europe, the Portuguese crown celebrated each new milestone. News of successful returns spread quickly through Lisbon. Exotic goods arrived in ports, including gold dust, ivory, pepper, animal skins, and enslaved Africans. These riches encouraged the kingdom to invest even more in exploration. The profits, though modest at first, hinted at far larger opportunities. And as Portuguese ships pushed farther south, they discovered new possibilities that had been unimaginable only decades before. The ocean, once a feared barrier, became a route to wealth that seemed limitless. The voyages were not only reshaping Africa's fate, but also changing Portugal itself. Sailors returned with stories that captivated the imagination. Merchants grew wealthy. Nobles competed to sponsor expeditions. Mapmakers updated charts with new lands, stretching the known world inch by inch. The idea that Portugal might reach the fabled riches of India by sailing around the African continent became more than a dream. It became an obsession. And the kingdom poured its resources into turning that obsession into reality. Yet while Portugal surged forward, the rest of Europe watched with a mixture of admiration, envy, and fear. Spain, in particular, understood that if Portugal succeeded in finding a direct route to Asia, its neighbor would gain an advantage that could last for generations. The Spanish crown felt the pressure building. Rivalry would soon drive Spain to set its own ambitions into motion, leading to journeys that would shake the world even more violently. But before that rivalry ignited, Portugal still had many miles of coast to conquer and many encounters ahead that would leave deep marks on the people it met. The African kingdoms were not passive observers in this story. They pushed back, negotiated, formed alliances, and at times resisted with powerful armies and fleets. Yet even the strongest among them could not fully stop the momentum that had been set in motion. The convergence of European ambition and African wealth created a storm that neither side fully understood at the time, a storm that was growing stronger with every voyage. As Portuguese ships continued slipping down the Atlantic coast of Africa, year after year, the voyages became bolder, more systematic, and increasingly driven by a vision that was no longer mere curiosity but a full geopolitical strategy. Each expedition was like a thread woven into an expanding tapestry, revealing more and more of a coastline that had once existed only as vague shapes on medieval maps. The early navigators, relying on memory and rudimentary instruments, learned to trust the winds and currents, recognizing patterns that would eventually become the great highways of transoceanic navigation. They discovered that the winds off North Africa, the steady northeasterly trades, could carry them southward with relative ease. But returning home required sailing west, out into the Atlantic, and then catching the westerly winds that curved back toward Europe. This technique, known as the vol du mar, or the turn of the sea, became one of Portugal's most groundbreaking contributions to global exploration. It revealed that the quickest path between two coasts often involved venturing far away from both. It also gave Portuguese sailors an advantage that would last for decades, because it opened routes that no other European kingdom yet understood. While the technical knowledge grew, the human consequences deepened. Along the African coast, the Portuguese established a chain of fortified settlements, feitorias, where merchants could trade goods under the protection of armed soldiers. These structures began as simple warehouses, but soon took on the characteristics of permanent, heavily defended outposts. Their presence disrupted local political systems, forcing African rulers to decide whether to cooperate with this new power, resist it, or attempt to manipulate it for their own interests. Some regions began to flourish briefly as intermediaries in the trade of gold and ivory, taking advantage of Portuguese demand. But the growing desire for human captives overshadowed all other commodities. Capturing people became, tragically, one of the most profitable aspects of these early encounters, and profit has a way of shaping decisions more strongly than any moral code. The Portuguese did not introduce slavery to Africa. Systems of bondage had existed in many societies for centuries, each with its own rules and conditions. What the Portuguese did introduce was a new scale and new brutality. Their desire for captives was not limited by war, debt, or custom. They wanted bodies that could be bought, sold, transported, branded, and worked until they collapsed. They wanted laborers who would fuel plantations, mines, and households across their expanding empire. And they wanted them in numbers that no existing local system had ever supplied. Some African rulers saw an opportunity and entered into alliances that allowed them to trade captives taken in local conflicts. Others resisted fiercely, refusing to participate in a growing market that threatened the future of their people. But the arrival of European warships, equipped with cannons and crossbows, shifted the balance of power. The Portuguese used force when negotiations failed, raiding villages, destroying coastal settlements, and taking captives by sheer violence. As the decades passed, the Portuguese advanced further south, tracing the curves of the African continent with increasing confidence. Cape Bojador, once considered an impassable boundary, was finally rounded. Then came Cape Verde, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and the Gulf of Guinea. Each new region brought fresh challenges. The heat was overwhelming. Tropical storms could rise without warning. Diseases that Portuguese sailors had never encountered swept through the cruise. Entire ships were lost, sometimes without a single survivor returning home to explain what had happened. But in Lisbon, the tragedies were overshadowed by the successes. When an expedition returned with gold dust, pepper, or enslaved people, the court celebrated as though the setbacks had never occurred. These celebrations encouraged more voyages, more investment, and more determination to push even farther. One of the most transformative regions the Portuguese reached was the Kingdom of Congo, a powerful and sophisticated state with its own system of governance, trade, and diplomacy. The initial encounters between Congo and Portugal were cautious, but not immediately hostile. Congo's rulers were curious about European goods, especially metal tools and weapons. The Portuguese, eager to create stable trading relationships, adapted themselves to the customs of the region. There were periods when diplomacy seemed to flourish, with exchanges of emissaries and gifts. Yet beneath these exchanges, Portugal's hunger for captives created pressures that would eventually fracture the kingdom's stability. Rival factions within Congo began competing for Portuguese support, sometimes waging war on neighboring communities to secure captives for trade. The arrival of the Portuguese magnified internal tensions and reshaped local power structures in ways that would destabilize the region for generations. Meanwhile, further down the coast, in the lands around present-day Ghana and Nigeria, Portuguese ships encountered wealthy and well-organized states such as the Akan and Benin. These societies controlled gold-rich territories and long-established trade networks that stretched inland. The Portuguese quickly recognized that the real wealth of West Africa lay not only in its coastal villages, but in the kingdoms that commanded trade routes across the continent. They attempted to negotiate access, sometimes politely, sometimes through threats or displays of force. But these states were not easily intimidated. Benin, for example, imposed strict rules on trade, forbidding Portuguese merchants from bypassing official channels. At times, the kingdom closed its borders altogether, refusing Portuguese entry. Such resistance frustrated the Portuguese, who were accustomed to dominating smaller coastal communities. But these encounters taught them that Africa was not a monolithic region waiting to be conquered. It was a continent of diverse and powerful civilizations, each demanding respect or confrontation. As the Portuguese continued southward, they approached the great rivers that served as arteries of African trade. The Congo River, the Niger River, and the Zambezi River offered glimpses of immense inland wealth. Portuguese explorers dreamed of reaching legendary cities rumored to be filled with gold, such as the fabled kingdom of Prester John, which they believed lay somewhere beyond the horizon. These stories may seem fantastical now, but for Europeans of the time, they represented hope and ambition. The line between imagination and reality was thin, and the unknown territories of Africa were fertile ground for myths that promised glory. Gradually, the Portuguese pressed on toward the southern edge of the continent. They established new posts, charted new winds, and recorded the shape of the coastline with increasing precision. By now, the goal was clear. They wanted to reach India, the source of spices that European markets valued more than almost anything else. The idea of a sea route to India had transformed from a dream to a national obsession. Each new stretch of coastline conquered brought the Portuguese closer to this prize. Their navigators studied the stars with growing sophistication, and their shipbuilders improved designs to withstand the violent ocean currents near the southern tip of Africa. And then, late in the 15th century, the moment arrived. Bartolomeu Dias, commanding a small fleet of ships, was caught in a violent storm that blew him far off the coast. When he finally regained control and turned his ship eastward, he realized he had rounded the southernmost tip of Africa. He had found the passage that would eventually lead to India. He called the cape he rounded the Cape of Storms, for the winds and waves had battered his fleet so ferociously that many believed they would never survive. But when news of the discovery reached the Portuguese king, the name was changed to the Cape of Good Hope. It was renamed not because the seas were calm, but because the king understood that this was the key Portugal had been seeking for decades. The door to the Indian Ocean was now open, if only they could find the right winds to guide them through. Dias's accomplishment electrified Portugal. The coastline of Africa, once feared as a place of myth, now stood revealed as a route to unimaginable wealth. The voyages would continue, and soon Vasco da Gama would complete the passage all the way to India. But before that chapter begins, it is important to recognize what Dias's discovery meant for the world. It was not simply a navigational triumph. It was the completion of a long period of expansion that had already reshaped Africa, destabilized communities, expanded slavery, and linked distant regions through chains of trade and conflict. Portugal's drive to reach India had lifted the veil on the African coast, exposing it to European ambitions that would never again be restrained. And as Portugal forged ahead, other European kingdoms watched with growing anxiety. The race for global dominance was no longer theoretical. It had begun, and soon, rivalry would push Spain to launch expeditions that would reach lands Portugal had never imagined. When Christopher Columbus prepared to set sail in 1492, Europe had already been caught in a frenzy of speculation, ambition, and greed. Stories of wealth to the south and east had ignited imaginations for decades, and Portugal had demonstrated that oceanic travel could yield both treasure and territorial advantage. But Spain was determined not to fall behind. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, understood that every unclaimed coastline represented not only opportunity, but a potential threat. They had recently completed the Reconquista, expelling the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula, and were eager to project their newfound power beyond Europe's familiar shores. Columbus, an Italian navigator with ambitious proposals, convinced them that he could reach Asia by sailing westward. To modern eyes, his miscalculations about the size of the world seemed naive, but to the people of his time, he appeared to offer a shortcut to unimaginable wealth. Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The journey was perilous from the start. Supplies were limited, the Atlantic was vast and mysterious, and storms threatened to overturn everything. Yet, after weeks at sea, land finally appeared on the horizon. What Columbus found was not the islands of Asia he had envisioned, but the Caribbean, a region inhabited by vibrant societies such as the Taino and Arawak peoples. To Columbus and the Europeans who followed, the islands seemed ripe for claim and exploitation, and they wasted no time imposing their authority. The initial encounters were a mixture of curiosity, misunderstanding, and coercion. The Taino welcomed the newcomers with generosity, offering food, guidance, and gifts. Columbus reported their friendliness with amazement, noting their apparent docility and willingness to trade. But this perception would be the foundation for a system of exploitation that would devastate the islands. The Europeans saw only opportunity. They saw labor to be extracted, resources to be taken, and territory to be claimed in the name of the crown and the church. They established the encomienda system, a structure that granted settlers control over indigenous communities, forcing men, women, and children to work under brutal conditions. Disease, introduced unintentionally by the Europeans, spread rapidly, decimating populations who had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and influenza. Within a few decades, entire islands were depopulated or reduced to shadows of their former vitality. Violence accompanied disease. Columbus and subsequent governors punished resistance ruthlessly, often executing leaders to maintain control. Indigenous social structures were dismantled. Agricultural systems collapsed. Spiritual and cultural practices were suppressed or outlawed. What had begun as a journey of supposed discovery had transformed into a campaign of conquest, exploitation, and terror. The Caribbean islands became laboratories of colonial oppression, demonstrating the dark potential of European expansion when combined with new maritime technologies and unrestrained ambition. Even as news of gold, spices, and exotic goods reached Spain, the human cost was largely ignored or rationalized. Letters and reports often minimized the suffering of native peoples, framing resistance as disobedience and mortality from disease as natural. The narrative of heroism and discovery obscured the lived reality of thousands, and it set a precedent that would be repeated across the Americas in the decades to come. Columbus's voyages were not the beginning of European presence in the New World, but they were the moment when expansion became systematic, organized, and backed by state power, with consequences that were immediate, devastating, and far-reaching. The impact was not limited to the Caribbean alone. These early expeditions laid the groundwork for the Spanish conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires. Hernán Cortés would later march into Tenochtitlan, Pizarro into Cusco, each following a pattern of alliance, deception, and violence that had already been tested in the islands. The model was clear: establish control, exploit labor, extract wealth, and justify actions with a mix of religious ideology and claims of discovery. This model created immense wealth for Spain, but at the expense of human life, cultural destruction, and the trauma of entire civilizations. The Caribbean experience also revealed a brutal truth that would shape the age of exploration. European technological superiority and organizational ruthlessness often outweighed numbers or local knowledge. Ships with cannons could dominate indigenous fleets. Steel swords and crossbows gave Europeans advantages over weapons made from wood, stone, or bone. Smallpox and other diseases acted as invisible allies, weakening societies before battles even began. What appeared as conquest achieved by bravery or strategy alone was, in reality, the combined effect of technology, disease, and merciless economic extraction. From this point, the dark pattern of exploration continued to unfold across the Americas. Islands became depopulated, agricultural systems collapsed, gold and silver were extracted, and the Spanish crown amassed wealth that funded further military and political expansion in Europe. Indigenous people were enslaved, relocated, or killed, and entire ways of life disappeared under the weight of European ambition. The story of the Caribbean serves as a window into the broader narrative of the age of exploration. a narrative in which glory and discovery cannot be separated from destruction, in which progress for some was paid for by suffering for others, and in which the world was irrevocably transformed by the collision of societies with dramatically unequal power. When Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in 1519, he entered a land that was already densely populated, highly organized, and technologically sophisticated in its own right. The Aztec Empire stretched across the Valley of Mexico, a network of cities, towns, and agricultural systems that fed millions. Tenochtitlan, the capital city, rose from the marshes on a series of islands connected by canals and causeways, a marvel of engineering that rivaled anything in Europe. Markets bustled with goods including cacao, textiles, obsidian tools, and food staples like maize and beans. Religious life was deeply embedded in daily routines, with ceremonies, temples, and a pantheon of gods guiding both governance and culture. Cortés, like Columbus before him, was not discovering emptiness but entering a world full of life, complexity, and history. From the outset, Cortés relied on a combination of military strategy, diplomacy, and deception. He formed alliances with indigenous groups who had long resented Aztec domination, capitalizing on existing rivalries to bolster his forces. Thousands of local warriors joined him, swelling the ranks of his small Spanish contingent. These alliances reveal a nuance often missing from simplistic stories of conquest. European success depended not only on technology, but also on exploiting divisions and misunderstandings among the native peoples themselves. Yet no alliance could have compensated for the other forms of power that the Spaniards wielded, the devastating impact of disease and the psychological shock of unfamiliar weapons. Smallpox and other European diseases began spreading even before the first major battles were fought. The Aztecs had no immunity to these pathogens, and epidemics ravaged communities at a terrifying rate. Entire villages were emptied within weeks. The collapse of population undermined social structures, disrupted food production, and eroded the ability of the Aztecs to resist militarily. What European chroniclers often described as divine favor or miraculous victory was in large part a tragic consequence of disease, invisible yet deadly, that preceded conquest and left societies vulnerable long before a single sword was raised. When Cortés finally entered Tenochtitlan, he encountered a city of astonishing wealth and scale. He marveled at the gold adorning temples, palaces, and statues, and he soon set about sending it back to Spain, fueling the fantasies of European kings and financiers who had invested in these expeditions. But the cost was enormous. The conquest involved repeated massacres, the destruction of neighborhoods, the desecration of temples, and systematic enslavement of those who survived. The Spanish justified these acts through a combination of religious ideology and claims of discovery, portraying the Aztecs as heathens in need of salvation. Yet the reality was far simpler. The empire was being dismantled to extract wealth and establish political control. Tens of thousands of people died in the fighting, and even more succumbed to hunger and disease in the aftermath. Farther south, Francisco Pizarro would replicate these patterns in the Andes with the Inca Empire. The Incas controlled a territory spanning hundreds of miles of rugged mountains, with complex agricultural terraces, road networks, and a highly centralized government that collected tribute and maintained order. Like Cortés, Pizarro arrived with a small force of Spaniards, but leveraged local discontent and rivalries to his advantage. In the Inca case, a recent civil war between brothers competing for the throne had weakened the empire, making it more susceptible to foreign manipulation. Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, demanded an enormous ransom in gold and silver, and executed him anyway, demonstrating the utter ruthlessness of European ambitions. Cities were looted, temples destroyed, and local governance replaced with Spanish authority. In a matter of years, the Incas went from being one of the largest, wealthiest, and most organized civilizations in the Americas to a subjugated people under European control. The human cost of these conquests is difficult to overstate. Scholars estimate that the population of Mexico may have dropped by as much as 80 to 90% within a century of European arrival, primarily due to disease, but exacerbated by warfare, forced labor, and disruption of agriculture. In the Andes, a similar collapse occurred. Social structures that had sustained millions for centuries were decimated. Survivors were often compelled to work in mines extracting silver, which became one of the most valuable commodities in global trade, fueling European economies and wars thousands of miles away. The wealth accumulated in Spain was built directly upon the suffering, enslavement, and death of indigenous peoples. These patterns, alliances used to divide, disease to weaken, violence to conquer, and resource extraction to enrich European powers, became the blueprint for much of the Americas. Colonies were not established merely to plant flags or collect knowledge. They were established to produce wealth, to dominate labor, and to transform entire regions to serve European interests. Religion was used to justify the process, portraying conquest as a divine mission to save souls, but the underlying drive was material: gold, silver, and the control of people themselves. The consequences of these conquests extended far beyond the immediate regions. The influx of precious metals from the Americas into Europe destabilized economies, led to inflation, and funded wars that shaped European politics for generations. Entire societies in the Americas disappeared or were radically altered. Languages, traditions, and cultural practices were suppressed or eradicated. And yet, the historical narrative for centuries framed these events as triumphs of European courage, intelligence, and civilization, leaving the dark reality: the deaths, enslavement, and cultural destruction, hidden beneath tales of discovery and progress. What began with Columbus in the Caribbean and escalated with Cortés and Pizarro represents the full collision of exploration and exploitation. European arrival was rarely a meeting of equals. It was the imposition of power backed by weapons, disease, and ideology. The age of exploration was, in these contexts, not a story of innocent discovery, but a story of conquest and suffering, a process through which wealth was extracted at an enormous cost to human life. These events set patterns that would continue for centuries, forming the backbone of colonial systems that reached across continents. From here, the narrative moves to the global system that emerged from these conquests, including the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, the flow of silver and gold into Europe, and the reshaping of economies across 3 continents. These developments would forever link Africa, Europe, and the Americas in ways that define the modern world. As the Spanish and Portuguese empires consolidated their hold over the Americas, it became increasingly clear that labor was the engine of European wealth. The indigenous populations, once numbered in the millions, had been decimated by disease, war, and exploitation, leaving vast tracts of land under European control but scarcely enough hands to cultivate it. Sugar plantations, gold and silver mines, and urban settlements required constant labor, yet the surviving native communities were neither large enough nor willing to sustain these demands. It was in this context that Europeans turned their gaze once more to Africa, initiating a system of human commodification that would come to define the next several centuries: the transatlantic slave trade. The process began incrementally, often with local African intermediaries. Coastal kingdoms had long participated in systems of slavery, usually as a result of war, debt, or punishment. But the Portuguese introduced a scale, brutality, and purpose that was unprecedented. European ships arrived at fortified trading posts, exchanging metal goods, firearms, textiles, and other European commodities for men, women, and children captured inland. Unlike the systems that had existed previously, which were integrated into local social and economic networks, the new European-driven trade prioritized quantity and profitability above all else. People were torn from their homes, sometimes through violent raids, sometimes through coercion, and often through alliances that incentivized African rulers to participate in their own population's destruction. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a crucible of unimaginable suffering. Ships were overcrowded, with hundreds of human beings chained together in dark, suffocating holds. Disease spread rapidly. Malnutrition and dehydration were constant companions. Many captives died before the ship even reached its destination, their bodies thrown overboard without ceremony. Those who survived arrived in the Americas physically weakened, psychologically shattered, and entirely stripped of agency. The economic system that followed depended upon this dehumanization. Slaves were sold at auction, assigned to plantations or mines, and forced to labor under grueling conditions, often until death. Families were separated permanently, languages and cultures were suppressed, and communities that had thrived for generations were shattered almost beyond recognition. Europe's appetite for wealth was unrelenting. Sugar became one of the most lucrative commodities of the time, and plantations demanded enormous numbers of enslaved laborers. Tobacco, cotton, coffee, and other crops soon followed, linking European markets to the forced labor of African populations across the Atlantic. The trade did not merely feed European luxury, it fueled the growth of entire nations. Cities like Lisbon, Seville, and later London, Amsterdam, and not thrived on the profits extracted from enslaved people and their labor. Banks and trading companies were established to manage the scale of commerce, creating financial systems that depended on human suffering. These economic structures allowed European powers to dominate not only the Americas, but also the oceans and, eventually, much of the globe. The human consequences were catastrophic. Tens of millions of Africans were uprooted from their homelands over the centuries. The demographic collapse in many regions weakened societies, disrupted local economies, and fostered long-term instability. Cultural knowledge, social hierarchies, and political institutions were destroyed or severely undermined. The people who survived the Middle Passage were forced to adapt under conditions of extreme oppression, creating new communities under impossible circumstances, maintaining fragments of language, religion, and culture in the shadow of a system that sought to erase their humanity entirely. Resistance, rebellion, and survival were constants. Mutinies aboard ships, uprisings on plantations, and the preservation of cultural identity in defiance of every effort to strip it away. Yet the scale of destruction and exploitation remained staggering, a grim testament to the European appetite for profit and control. It is important to recognize that this system was not accidental or chaotic. It was deliberate, highly organized, and justified through ideology. European thinkers, clergy, and merchants constructed elaborate moral and religious rationales to defend the enslavement of millions. Africans were depicted as naturally inferior, destined for servitude, or in need of Christian salvation that Europeans claimed could only be delivered through submission. These rationalizations masked the reality. The trade existed purely to extract labor, enrich European coffers, and expand imperial power. The ideology was a veneer over what was, in every essential way, exploitation and mass violence on an unprecedented scale. The transatlantic slave trade also reshaped Africa in profound ways. Coastal kingdoms grew powerful as intermediaries, armed and incentivized by European goods, while inland regions suffered from increased warfare and raids aimed at capturing captives for export. Societies were destabilized, populations reduced, and political power redistributed along the lines imposed by European demand. In some cases, kingdoms collapsed entirely under the strain. The consequences of this disruption are still evident today, as patterns of inequality, conflict, and underdevelopment can often be traced back to the demographic and social upheavals initiated during this period. Simultaneously, the influx of precious metals from the Americas fueled another dark aspect of this era. Silver from mines such as Potosi flowed into European economies and through trade into Asia. While Europe celebrated its new wealth, the process of extraction was equally brutal. Indigenous laborers, often enslaved under the Mita system in the Andes, endured grueling conditions that led to mass mortality. Mercury poisoning, exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease killed thousands in the pursuit of silver that would ultimately fund European ambitions. The connection between the Americas, Africa, and Europe formed the foundation of a truly global system of exploitation, one in which human life was repeatedly sacrificed for profit, empire, and the advancement of European power. This triangular system of trade, Europeans taking manufactured goods to Africa, exchanging them for enslaved people, transporting those people to the Americas, and shipping commodities back to Europe, remains one of the starkest examples of the hidden costs of the age of exploration. The narrative of discovery and progress, often presented to later generations, masks the suffering, the coercion, and the calculated violence that made such wealth possible. To speak of the age of exploration as a series of heroic voyages is to ignore the tens of millions of lives uprooted, the cultural destruction, and the lasting social scars inflicted across continents. Even as these systems took root, resistance persisted. African captives organized revolts on ships and on plantations, sometimes escaping to form maroon communities in remote regions. Indigenous peoples in the Americas attempted uprisings, though often undermined by disease, technology, and division. These acts of defiance were courageous, dangerous, and rarely recorded in European accounts. But they remind us that the history of exploration is also a history of resilience and struggle against overwhelming oppression. The establishment of this transatlantic system marked a pivotal moment in human history. It was not an isolated tragedy, but the central mechanism through which European powers asserted global dominance during the age of exploration. Wealth flowed into European hands, kingdoms expanded, and markets flourished. But the price was immense, measured in lives lost, societies destroyed, and cultures irreversibly altered. This dark legacy would continue for centuries, linking Africa, Europe, and the Americas in ways that define the political, social, and economic structures of the modern world. As Portuguese ships and later fleets from Spain, the Netherlands, and England began venturing into the Indian Ocean, a different kind of conquest unfolded, one that combined commerce, military technology, and coercion rather than outright territorial takeover, at least at first. The region they encountered was already home to thriving civilizations with centuries of established trade. India, China, Japan, and the archipelagos of Southeast Asia were connected by networks that moved spices, textiles, silver, porcelain, and other commodities across vast distances. These routes had long been dominated by Muslim and Hindu merchants, whose expertise and influence controlled the flow of goods from the interior of Asia to its ports. European powers had arrived not as equals but as interlopers, seeking to wrest control of trade by force, cunning, and the growing military superiority that gunpowder had conferred. The Portuguese were the first to gain a foothold in this system, arriving in India at Calicut in 1498 under Vasco da Gama. His journey represented the culmination of decades of technological innovation, careful navigation, and relentless ambition. The arrival of da Gama and his fleet sent shockwaves through the established trading cities. While the Portuguese initially relied on diplomacy, they quickly demonstrated a willingness to use violence to assert control over trade routes. They established fortified trading posts, or feitorias, along the coast of India and later in places such as Malacca and the Moluccas, the islands known as the Spice Islands. These outposts were not mere warehouses. They were armed centers of coercion, projecting European military power into societies that had operated independently for centuries. The impact on local populations was profound. Coastal communities were drawn into European conflicts, caught between the demands of foreign powers and the shifting loyalties of regional rulers. Trade networks that had flourished for centuries were disrupted as Portuguese ships enforced monopolies and demanded tribute. The Europeans had a technological advantage, heavily armed ships with cannons, firearms, and steel swords. But the real innovation lay in their combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and control of sea lanes. Resistance was met with overwhelming force, often indiscriminate in its impact. Civilians were killed, markets destroyed, and cities subjected to sieges or bombardments, all in the pursuit of profit. Yet Europe's influence in Asia was not only military. Economic and social transformations occurred as European goods and practices were introduced. Silver mined in the Americas began to flow into Asia to pay for spices, silk, and porcelain. Local economies became increasingly intertwined with European demands, creating dependencies that shifted traditional patterns of trade. While Europeans rarely controlled large territories in Asia in the way they had in the Americas, their influence over commerce and politics reshaped the region, creating new hierarchies of wealth and power. Indigenous merchants, rulers, and laborers were often coerced into participating in systems that served European interests, whether through taxes, forced supply of goods, or controlled trade routes. In addition, the arrival of Europeans carried cultural and religious pressures. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, accompanied many voyages, seeking to convert local populations to Christianity. While some interactions were peaceful and resulted in limited cultural exchange, others were coercive, as religious conversion was often used to justify political or economic intervention. Temples and sacred sites could be destroyed or repurposed, local customs condemned as pagan, and new institutions imposed in the name of salvation. Once again, the veneer of moral or religious justification masked the deeper reality. European expansion in Asia was driven primarily by profit and power, with local populations subject to exploitation and coercion. The Portuguese were eventually joined and challenged by other European powers. The Dutch, with the Dutch East India Company, and the English, with the British East India Company, arrived with similar goals but often greater resources. These companies were early forms of multinational corporations, empowered by state authority to wage war, negotiate treaties, and extract resources. Their operations further entrenched the exploitation of local populations. As labor was coerced, agriculture redirected toward European markets, and cities forced into trade structures that served foreign interests. Competition between European powers often escalated into localized warfare, with coastal communities and small kingdoms suffering the brunt of the violence. Throughout these interactions, the dark pattern that had emerged in Africa and the Americas continued to play out in Asia. Indigenous peoples were rarely passive. They resisted, negotiated, and adapted. Yet the combined pressures of European military technology, economic coercion, and strategic manipulation created a system heavily skewed toward European advantage. Wealth flowed outward to Europe, labor and production were redirected toward foreign profit, and local political systems were weakened, fragmented, or co-opted. What might have been a mutually beneficial exchange in an earlier period was transformed into a relationship of extraction and domination. At the same time, the global scale of Europe's ambitions became increasingly clear. Spices from the Moluccas traveled across oceans to feed European appetites. Silver from the Americas flowed through Asia to purchase these goods, and enslaved Africans worked in colonies in the Caribbean to produce sugar and other commodities. This interconnected system, Europe exploiting Africa, the Americas, and Asia simultaneously, was unprecedented. It was profitable, yes, but it was sustained through systematic violence, coercion, and the imposition of European priorities over human life and indigenous systems. The environmental and cultural consequences were also profound. European demand reshaped agricultural patterns, encouraged the growth of cash crops, and disrupted local ecosystems. Entire regions saw forests cleared for plantations, irrigation altered to suit European crops, and fishing intensified to meet urban markets thousands of miles away. Cultural practices were suppressed, languages eroded, and social hierarchies overturned to accommodate European trade and political structures. In Asia, as in Africa and the Americas, the age of exploration was not only about discovery, it was about domination, extraction, and transformation imposed from outside. By the early 17th century, the map of global commerce had been irrevocably altered. European powers controlled the flow of goods, labor, and wealth on an unprecedented scale. They had established fortified posts from India to Japan, from the Spice Islands to Southeast Asia, and were increasingly willing to use force to maintain their monopolies. Local populations were caught in the crossfire, experiencing both the immediate violence of conquest and the long-term effects of economic subjugation. The narrative of exploration, often told as a story of bravery and innovation, concealed the darker truths of coercion, exploitation, and human suffering that underpinned Europe's rise to global dominance. The expansion into Asia highlights the age of exploration as a truly global project, one in which ambition, technology, and greed created networks that spanned continents. It shows that European power was not simply the result of superior ideas or culture, but the product of systems designed to extract wealth and labor from diverse peoples across the world. From the African coast to the Caribbean to the Spice Islands of Asia, the same patterns recur: intrusion, exploitation, coercion, and profit at the expense of countless lives. By the 16th century, the web of European expansion had become vast, connecting continents in ways that had never before been possible. The Americas, Africa, Europe, and Asia were now linked through commerce, labor, and extraction on an unprecedented scale. Central to this system was the massive flow of precious metals from the New World, particularly silver from mines in Mexico and the Andes. Miners, often indigenous people conscripted through systems like the encomienda and the mida, labored in horrific conditions, extracting wealth that would ultimately fuel Europe's growing global ambitions. In places like Potosi in present-day Bolivia, entire mountains were stripped for their silver content, and the laborers endured crushing exhaustion, mercury poisoning, and death in staggering numbers. The mines produced enormous quantities of silver, which flowed to Europe, where it funded the crown, armies, and the growing infrastructure of empire, and then onward to Asia, where it was exchanged for spices, textiles, and luxury goods. This silver trade had consequences far beyond economics. It destabilized indigenous societies, eroded local autonomy, and shifted the balance of power both within the Americas and globally. In Europe, the sudden influx of wealth fueled inflation and intensified competition between kingdoms, compelling them to expand overseas even further. In Asia, silver became a critical currency, binding China, India, and Southeast Asia more tightly to European trade networks, often on terms imposed by foreign powers. What seemed at first a natural exchange of commodities was, in reality, a highly asymmetric system, with Europe extracting disproportionate benefits through coercion, monopolies, and military enforcement. The environmental consequences of these operations were equally dramatic. Colonization and resource extraction radically altered landscapes. Forests were cleared to make way for sugar, coffee, and tobacco plantations. Rivers were diverted to supply water to mining operations. Large-scale agriculture introduced monocultures that replaced indigenous ecosystems and created vulnerabilities to pests and soil depletion. Animals, plants, and diseases crossed oceans in the so-called Columbian Exchange, transforming life on multiple continents. European-introduced diseases decimated indigenous populations in the Americas, while plants like wheat, sugarcane, and coffee reshaped agriculture. In Africa, European demand for labor intensified warfare and displacement, while in the Americas, Forced labor and extraction systems destroyed local food production, leading to famine and social collapse in many regions. This was not simply incidental damage. It was a structural feature of European expansion. Colonization, mining, and plantation agriculture were designed to maximize profit, and the environmental and social costs were considered acceptable by the powers implementing them. What followed was a systematic transformation of the planet, from human demographics to ecological systems. Entire species were introduced to new continents, often causing ecological collapse, while human populations were forcibly moved, enslaved, or exterminated. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, for instance, relied on soil and water-intensive cultivation techniques, sustained entirely by enslaved labor, and irreversibly altered local ecologies. The very geography of the world was being reshaped in the pursuit of wealth and empire. Economically, the age of exploration laid the foundations of modern capitalism. Trade networks, multinational companies like the Dutch East India Company, and financial instruments such as credit, bonds, and insurance were developed to manage the unprecedented scale of global commerce. The flow of goods, labor, and silver enabled European powers to dominate global markets, but the system's foundation was fundamentally exploitative. Labor was coerced, entire populations were uprooted, and wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few elites who controlled ships, ports, and mercantile infrastructure. Indigenous peoples and Africans bore the full cost of the wealth that European nations extracted, creating deep inequalities that persist even today. The human dimension of this transformation cannot be overstated. Entire societies were destroyed or forced into servitude. Indigenous populations in the Americas, reduced by disease, massacres, and forced labor, often lost 80 to 90% of their numbers within a century of European contact. African communities were destabilized, with millions uprooted and transported across the Atlantic. Laborers in mines and plantations endured brutal conditions that shortened lifespans and disrupted families and communities. The creation of wealth for Europe came at a staggering cost in human suffering, making it impossible to separate the economic transformation from the human tragedy that underpinned it. Religion and ideology were often invoked to justify these transformations. Missionaries sought to convert indigenous populations, while European rulers framed conquest as a divine mandate. The doctrine of discovery, papal bulls, and other legal instruments provided a moral and legal veneer to European claims, even as they violated existing sovereignty and human rights. Cultural erasure accompanied economic exploitation. Languages, traditions, and religious practices were suppressed or replaced. While some cultural exchanges did occur, they often happened under coercion or within heavily asymmetrical power dynamics, further highlighting the darker aspects of the age of exploration. This global transformation was not uniform. Some societies resisted successfully, creating pockets of autonomy or negotiating favorable trade arrangements. African states sometimes used European demand to consolidate power internally, while indigenous groups in the Americas and Asia resisted conquest or formed alliances to protect their autonomy. Yet the overall trajectory was clear. European expansion systematically extracted wealth and labor, reshaped economies, and imposed ecological and social systems designed to benefit Europe at the expense of others. Even as Europe celebrated new riches and technological achievement, the dark consequences continued to unfold. Entire continents were altered ecologically and demographically. Societies were destabilized, labor systems were violently coerced, and the human cost was immense. The age of exploration, often mythologized as an era of heroism and adventure, was in reality a global project of extraction, domination, and transformation, with effects that echo across the modern world. Religion was never merely a spiritual concern in the age of exploration. It was a tool of power, a means to legitimize conquest, and a moral framework through which Europeans justified actions that would otherwise have been recognized as violent, coercive, or immoral. The Catholic Church, closely aligned with the crowns of Spain and Portugal, provided both ideological and legal frameworks to sanction expansion. Papal bulls, such as Inter Caetera in 1493, granted Spain the right to claim lands across the Atlantic, while ostensibly ensuring the spiritual welfare of indigenous peoples. These decrees framed colonization as a divine mission, casting European monarchs as instruments of God tasked with spreading Christianity to heathen peoples. In reality, the religious justification was inseparable from the pursuit of wealth, territory, and labor. It served as a moral cover for acts of violence, enslavement, and the suppression of entire cultures. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans, were often among the first Europeans to establish sustained contact with indigenous communities. While some genuinely sought to understand local customs and languages, the broader mission was coercive. Indigenous beliefs, spiritual practices, and social structures were considered inferior, pagan, or sinful, and European missionaries frequently destroyed temples, sacred objects, and other markers of local culture. Conversion was enforced through education, indoctrination, and at times outright coercion, particularly when aligned with colonial authorities. Even when presented as a benevolent effort, the imposition of Christianity disrupted centuries-old belief systems, reshaping societies in ways that subordinated indigenous identities to European norms. The concept of the doctrine of discovery exemplifies how religion intertwined with empire to justify conquest. Under this principle, lands inhabited by non-Christians could be claimed and governed by Christian rulers, with the assumption that indigenous peoples had no legitimate sovereignty. This doctrine provided a legal and theological rationale for the seizure of territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. It allowed explorers, merchants, and conquistadors to treat indigenous peoples as subjects to be governed, laborers to be coerced, or obstacles to be removed, all under the guise of divine authority. In effect, religion became an instrument to naturalize domination, making the extraordinary violence of colonization appear morally acceptable to contemporary European audiences. Yet the religious veneer did not mask the brutality for those subjected to it. In the Caribbean, indigenous peoples were forced to labor under the encomienda system, their labor considered a divine right of the conquerors. Resistance, whether spiritual, physical, or cultural, was punished with violence. In the Americas, churches were often built on the ruins of temples, with sacred artifacts destroyed or repurposed. In Africa, European traders sometimes used religious rationales to legitimize the enslavement and export of people, framing it as a path to Christian salvation or civilizing instruction. Across the Indian Ocean, missionary efforts in India, Japan, and Southeast Asia were often intertwined with military coercion and monopolistic trade policies, reinforcing the link between religious justification and material exploitation. Religion also intersected with emerging imperial structures to create enduring systems of inequality. The crowns of Spain and Portugal, and later other European powers, claimed sovereignty over vast territories under the guise of divine sanction. Colonial administrations were organized to enforce European law, extract tribute, and maintain labor systems, all while promoting religious conversion. Legal codes, missionary reports, and royal decrees constructed a worldview in which European domination was presented as a moral and natural order, obscuring the suffering and violence on which it depended. Cultural destruction, mass mortality, and social dislocation were framed as inevitable or even beneficial for the souls of those conquered. The intertwining of religion and empire also reinforced hierarchies of race and power that would persist for centuries. European explorers, settlers, and administrators often used religious identity to justify the subjugation of non-Christian peoples, creating a moral hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africans in the transatlantic slave trade, and Asians under European-controlled trade networks were all positioned within this hierarchy, their labor and lands subordinated to the demands of empire. This religiously sanctioned worldview allowed exploitation to proceed with minimal moral scrutiny among Europeans themselves, even as it inflicted immense suffering on the colonized. The consequences were both immediate and long-lasting. Indigenous populations faced mortality rates unparalleled in human history. Social systems and governance structures were dismantled or repurposed to serve European goals. Cultural knowledge, languages, and religious practices were suppressed, sometimes irretrievably. And the ideological structures of conquest, the claims of divine sanction, the doctrine of discovery, and the moral framing of European supremacy persisted long after the initial voyages, influencing colonial policies, law, and international norms for centuries. Even in cases where conversion or European influence brought education, literacy, or new technologies, these were invariably tied to control. Religious instruction was inseparable from colonial authority. Schools were often instruments of assimilation, teaching obedience to European rulers and religious authorities rather than empowering indigenous communities. Cultural hybridity emerged, but often under coercive conditions, producing societies that were partially Europeanized, yet also deeply scarred by the violence, disruption, and displacement that had accompanied the initial contact. In examining the role of religion and empire, the dark truth of the age of exploration becomes starkly clear. European expansion was not solely a story of daring voyages or commercial success. It was a deliberate, structured system of extraction and control, justified through ideology, sustained by violence, and enforced through religious and legal authority. This intertwining of moral justification and exploitation enabled Europeans to reshape the world on their terms, while obscuring the human suffering that lay at the foundation of their empires. The Columbian Exchange refers to the massive, often irreversible movement of plants, animals, diseases, and even humans between the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, the Americas, that began with Columbus's voyages in 1492. It is frequently celebrated for introducing crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes to Europe, and wheat, rice, and sugarcane to the Americas. But beneath the surface of this narrative lies a more troubling reality. These exchanges were inseparable from conquest, forced labor, and ecological devastation. European diseases were perhaps the deadliest agents of change. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus swept through indigenous populations of the Americas, where people had no immunity. Communities that had thrived for centuries were decimated in mere decades. Entire cities emptied, farms were abandoned, and social structures collapsed under the weight of mortality. In some regions, up to 90% of the population perished, creating demographic vacuums that Europeans exploited to establish control over land and labor. The biological impact was inseparable from the political and economic consequences. Depopulation made it easier for colonists to impose forced labor systems, claim land, and extract resources without effective resistance. Disease, in effect, became a silent partner in conquest. Conversely, Europeans introduced animals such as horses, pigs, cattle, and sheep into the Americas, radically altering landscapes and indigenous ways of life. Horses transformed mobility, hunting, and warfare among some indigenous groups, but livestock also disrupted local ecosystems, overgrazing native vegetation and spreading disease among native animals. European introduced plants, including wheat, sugarcane, and coffee, often replaced local crops, reshaping agricultural systems to serve European markets. These changes were not neutral. They created ecological dependencies and vulnerabilities that undermined traditional food systems, and in many cases, contributed to famine when local populations could no longer sustain themselves independently. The exchange also facilitated the global spread of cash crops, which became central to European colonial economies. Sugar, grown initially in the Caribbean and Brazil, demanded enormous labor and water-intensive cultivation. Plantations replaced subsistence agriculture, forcing African and indigenous laborers into grueling work that depleted soil, altered hydrological systems, and created monocultures vulnerable to pests and disease. Similarly, tobacco in North America reshaped landscapes, leading to deforestation and the displacement of local flora and fauna. These environmental transformations were directly tied to human exploitation. Ecological change was driven by the same economic imperatives that fueled slavery, forced labor, and resource extraction. Another critical aspect of the Columbian Exchange was the spread of invasive species. Rats, weeds, and other organisms accompanied European ships across the oceans, often destroying local species and disrupting delicate ecological balances. Native species in the Americas and elsewhere had evolved in isolation, and the sudden arrival of foreign plants, animals, and pathogens caused cascading effects. Forests, rivers, and agricultural lands were reshaped, sometimes irreversibly, demonstrating that the consequences of exploration extended far beyond human society. Even when Europeans brought crops or animals to new regions to increase food supply, the changes often had unintended, destructive consequences that undermined local ecosystems. The environmental consequences were tightly interwoven with economic exploitation. European demand for sugar, cotton, and other commodities drove the expansion of plantations, which in turn reshaped landscapes and required enormous labor inputs. Mining for silver and gold also had environmental consequences. Rivers were diverted, forests cleared for fuel, and mercury used in refining contaminated soils and water. These practices caused long-term ecological damage that persisted centuries beyond the initial period of conquest. For the indigenous and African populations subjected to this labor, environmental degradation directly compounded human suffering. The land that sustained communities for generations became a source of forced labor and exploitation, illustrating the intersection of ecological and social violence. Perhaps most strikingly, the Columbian Exchange transformed the global flow of food and disease in ways that continue to resonate today. Staple crops from the Americas, potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and cacao, became foundational to diets in Europe, Africa, and Asia, altering population growth and agricultural practices. Similarly, Old World crops and animals changed the Americas' ecosystems and economies. Yet this benefit was inseparable from a history of conquest, dispossession, and forced labor. Every potato cultivated in Ireland or maize planted in Africa was part of a system that had first relied on violence, coercion, and the deaths of millions. The ecological transformation cannot be divorced from its human cost. The two were inseparable components of the same process. The Columbian Exchange also had subtle but profound long-term effects. Soil depletion, species extinction, and altered hydrological systems reshaped the natural environment in ways that persist to this day. Diseases introduced to indigenous populations created demographic collapses that altered settlement patterns and reduced human intervention in landscapes, sometimes allowing certain ecosystems to recover, but also eliminating traditional knowledge about environmental management. The age of exploration, in other words, was not only a human tragedy, it was an environmental catastrophe on a planetary scale, one driven by the same motives of profit, power, and domination that had fueled conquest and slavery. Even as European power celebrated their discoveries and profits, these environmental consequences were rarely considered. Maps, travel journals, and chronicles emphasized the richness of new lands and the abundance of resources, while the ecological devastation remained largely invisible in European accounts. The perception of the New World as a virgin and empty landscape erased not only indigenous peoples, but also the carefully managed ecosystems they had cultivated for centuries. Exploration was thus a process of both human and environmental colonization, reshaping the world in ways that benefited Europe while devastating countless lives and landscapes. The dark truth of this period is that the age of exploration was not a story of innocent curiosity, heroism, or mutual cultural exchange. It was a project of extraction and domination on multiple fronts: social, economic, and environmental. The Columbian Exchange illustrates this perfectly. It brought wealth, crops, and new species to Europe, Africa, and Asia, but only through a system of violence, coercion, and ecological disruption that left lasting scars on the planet and its peoples. The consequences of these transformations are still visible today, from demographic patterns and agricultural practices to environmental degradation and persistent inequalities rooted in centuries of exploitation. From the Caribbean to the Andes, from Africa to the Indian Ocean, resistance to European expansion took many forms: armed revolt, flight, negotiation, sabotage, and the preservation of cultural practices. In the Caribbean, the Taino and other indigenous groups initially sought to defend their homelands with whatever means were available. Although they lacked the firearms and armor of the Europeans, they used knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla tactics, and strategic retreats to resist colonization. Unfortunately, repeated attacks, combined with disease and forced labor, decimated populations. Entire villages were destroyed, yet survivors often fled into forests or mountains, preserving communities outside the reach of European control. These displaced groups maintained knowledge of agriculture, oral traditions, and spiritual practices that would influence later generations, even as European chroniclers often ignored or dismissed them. In Central and South America, resistance took more organized and large-scale forms. After the fall of the Aztec and Inca empires, indigenous leaders continued to rebel against Spanish authority. In Mexico, the Mixtan War and the Chichamca resistance exemplified indigenous groups uniting to fight European encroachment, often forming alliances across regions in defiance of colonial forces. In the Andes, the Mapuche of southern Chile resisted Spanish attempts at conquest for decades, maintaining autonomy in the face of relentless military campaigns. These struggles demonstrated that indigenous peoples were neither passive nor naive. They adapted strategies, formed coalitions, and waged protracted resistance despite facing technological and numerical disadvantages. The African resistance to the transatlantic slave trade was equally remarkable. Enslaved Africans on the ships of the Middle Passage sometimes revolted, using chains, makeshift weapons, and knowledge of maritime conditions to seize control of vessels. Although these uprisings were often suppressed with brutal violence, they underscored the unwillingness of people to accept enslavement passively. In the Americas, enslaved Africans engaged in everyday forms of resistance, including work slowdowns, sabotage of equipment, theft, and the preservation of language, music, and religious practices. In some regions, they escaped to establish maroon communities, hidden settlements in remote forests, mountains, or swamps. These communities became centers of autonomy and cultural preservation, resisting European authority and sustaining African traditions for generations. Cultural resistance was equally vital. Across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, indigenous and enslaved peoples maintained rituals, languages, and social customs despite European attempts at eradication. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian communities preserved elements of African religious practice, blending them with Catholicism to create syncretic traditions such as candomblé. In Mexico, Nahua communities maintained agricultural practices, oral histories, and communal governance under the guise of Spanish-imposed institutions. Even where European authority appeared total, these subtle forms of resistance allowed colonized peoples to assert identity, sustain community cohesion, and transmit knowledge across generations. Resistance was also visible in negotiations and alliances. Some indigenous and African leaders sought to leverage European presence for their own political advantage. They negotiated trade, military alliances, or autonomy in exchange for labor, resources, or loyalty. While often precarious and sometimes exploited by Europeans, these strategies reflect the agency and strategic thinking of local leaders. They illustrate that resistance was not limited to physical confrontation. It encompassed diplomacy, adaptation, and the careful management of limited power in the face of overwhelming European influence. Even enslaved populations in the Caribbean and North America developed organized rebellions that, while often suppressed, left lasting legacies. The 1522 rebellion in Santo Domingo, led by indigenous survivors, and later uprisings in Jamaica, Haiti, and Brazil, demonstrated that enslaved communities could coordinate resistance on large scales. These revolts inspired fear among European colonists, forced temporary concessions, and created enduring myths of courage, resilience, and defiance. The Haitian Revolution in the late 18th century, though centuries after the first voyages of Columbus, was a culmination of a long history of African resistance, showing that even centuries of oppression could be met with organized struggle and eventual triumph. Education, knowledge, and cultural memory became forms of survival. Oral histories preserved the stories of conquest, enslavement, and resistance, allowing subsequent generations to understand their heritage and maintain a sense of identity. Agricultural techniques, medicinal knowledge, religious rituals, and storytelling were all tools of resilience, ensuring that European domination could never completely erase the cultural and historical identities of colonized peoples. The stories of resistance and survival highlight a crucial truth. The age of exploration was not solely a story of European triumph. While conquest, enslavement, and environmental transformation inflicted staggering damage, the human capacity for resilience and resistance persisted. Indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and colonized communities shaped the historical trajectory of the period, challenging the narratives of passive victimhood often found in European chronicles. These acts of defiance remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, agency, courage, and survival played a defining role. At the same time, the persistence of resistance created fear, uncertainty, and instability for colonial powers, influencing policies and reinforcing systems of coercion. The fact that European empires had to constantly suppress uprisings, monitor enslaved populations, and negotiate with indigenous authorities demonstrates that domination was never complete or uncontested. This dynamic tension between oppression and resistance is central to the darker truth of the age of exploration. The wealth, power, and global networks established by Europeans were built atop human suffering, yet never without the ongoing presence of defiance and survival by those exploited. Even after conquest and initial settlement, the establishment of colonial systems across the Americas, Africa, and Asia represented a second wave of exploitation, more insidious and deeply entrenched. Europeans had not merely discovered new lands, they sought to remake them entirely, imposing hierarchical structures that subordinated indigenous populations and enslaved peoples to the interests of the crown, merchants, and settlers. In Spanish America, the encomienda and repartimiento systems were engineered to extract labor under the guise of protection and religious instruction. Under these systems, indigenous peoples were legally entrusted to Spanish settlers, who were required to provide for their welfare and religious instruction. In practice, these arrangements were coercive and often lethal. Indigenous laborers were forced into mining, agriculture, and construction, with little regard for safety, health, or human dignity. Mortality rates were extraordinarily high, and communities were torn apart as men, women, and children were conscripted into labor at the whim of colonial authorities. Similarly, the Portuguese implemented forced labor systems in Brazil and Africa, particularly on sugar plantations. Slavery here became increasingly formalized and hereditary, creating social hierarchies that would persist for centuries. The plantation economy was merciless in its efficiency. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were treated as property, denied basic rights, and subjected to brutal physical punishment to ensure productivity. European settlers and colonial administrators built wealth upon this system, often portraying themselves as civilized actors bringing development and Christianity, while ignoring or actively concealing the suffering on which their economies rested. In the English and Dutch colonies, patterns were similar, though often adapted to local conditions. The Caribbean sugar colonies, for example, relied on large-scale imports of enslaved Africans, creating a demographic reality in which the enslaved population vastly outnumbered Europeans. This imbalance generated fear among colonists, prompting draconian codes, armed patrols, and violent suppression to maintain control. Resistance, through rebellion, escape, or even subtle acts of sabotage, was met with execution, whipping, or forced isolation, reinforcing the pervasive climate of fear that underpinned colonial authority. The systems of trade that accompanied colonial administration were equally exploitative. Europeans controlled markets, monopolized key commodities, and dictated the flow of goods in ways that disadvantaged local producers and empowered the imperial centers. In Asia, for example, the Portuguese and later Dutch East India companies enforced strict monopolies on spices, often resorting to violence to suppress local competition. Islands such as Ambon and Banda were militarily occupied, and local populations were massacred or enslaved to guarantee production quotas for European markets. The combination of economic coercion, military enforcement, and religious justification created an intertwined system that was both ruthless and remarkably efficient in extracting wealth. Colonial society also produced new forms of inequality and social stratification. In the Americas, the racial hierarchy was carefully codified, placing Europeans at the top, mixed-race individuals in intermediary roles, and indigenous peoples and Africans at the bottom. These structures were enforced through laws, social norms, and daily interactions, shaping identity, opportunity, and access to power. Indigenous and African laborers were not merely exploited economically. They were subjected to cultural domination and systemic oppression, designed to strip them of autonomy, voice, and rights. Resistance in this context could take subtle forms, preserving languages, practicing forbidden rituals in secret, or maintaining community cohesion against the pressures of assimilation. Religious institutions were deeply entwined with these hierarchies. Missionaries operated schools, courts, and churches, effectively embedding colonial authority into daily life. In the Americas, Catholic missions became centers of control as much as spiritual instruction, regulating labor, morality, and social interaction. In Asia, Jesuit and Franciscan missionaries often advised governors, influencing policy to align with religious as well as commercial objectives. Religion served as both justification and tool of governance. Obedience to God was equated with obedience to colonial rulers, and failure to conform was treated as moral and social deviance. Life for those at the bottom of these hierarchies was a relentless struggle for survival. Enslaved Africans endured forced labor from sunrise to sunset, often with inadequate food, clothing, or shelter. Indigenous laborers faced similar exploitation, compounded by disease, cultural displacement, and violent repression. Women were particularly vulnerable, subjected not only to forced labor, but also to sexual violence, family separation, and exploitation under colonial systems that treated them as property. Children were often conscripted into work from a young age, growing up in a system that denied education, autonomy, and a safe childhood. The everyday realities of colonial life were defined by control, coercion, and survival, conditions that were rarely recorded in European accounts, which tended to glorify conquest and understate human suffering. Even within these oppressive systems, people found ways to resist and adapt. Enslaved Africans maintained cultural practices, adapted agricultural knowledge to new environments, and established networks of communication and support. Indigenous peoples continued to cultivate traditional crops, organize rebellions, and assert sovereignty in ways that delayed or mitigated complete European domination. These acts of resistance were not only practical, they were expressions of identity, memory, and moral defiance. They remind us that while the age of exploration created vast structures of control, it was never absolute. Human agency persisted in ways that complicated European narratives of inevitability and progress. The global scope of these systems is staggering. European powers were simultaneously extracting silver from the Andes, sugar from Brazil, spices from Southeast Asia, and labor from Africa, linking continents through a network of exploitation. The wealth accumulated through these systems funded European wars, art, architecture, and political power, while leaving lasting scars on the peoples and ecosystems of the colonized world. What is often celebrated as the rise of Europe was, in reality, built upon simultaneous processes of human suffering, environmental transformation, and cultural suppression on a planetary scale. This period also witnessed the creation of enduring myths about civilization, progress, and discovery. European narratives emphasized bravery, ingenuity, and moral superiority, casting colonized peoples as passive, backward, or in need of guidance. These narratives were crucial in maintaining domestic support for colonial ventures, obscuring the violence, coercion, and ecological destruction that made European wealth possible. The stories of conquest and exploration celebrated in art, literature, and maps were selective, designed to glorify empire while erasing the experiences of those who suffered under it. In essence, the systems established during this era created a world in which inequality, coercion, and exploitation were normalized and institutionalized. European powers were able to dominate through a combination of technology, ideology, and brute force, while the peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia were systematically subordinated. These structures not only produced wealth and power for Europe, they shaped global social hierarchies, economic systems, and environmental conditions in ways that persist to this day. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean stand as one of the most vivid examples of the age of exploration's dark legacy. After Columbus's voyages, European powers quickly realized the region's potential for sugar cultivation, a crop in high demand in Europe. Sugar was not merely a luxury. It became a commodity central to European diets, economies, and social rituals. To maximize production, Europeans relied almost entirely on enslaved African labor, imported through the brutal Middle Passage. Conditions on these plantations were extraordinarily harsh. Enslaved Africans were forced to work long hours under a blazing sun, clearing land, planting cane, and operating the mills that extracted the juice from the stalks. Sugarcane cultivation is particularly labor-intensive, requiring precise timing for planting, harvesting, and processing. Mistakes could ruin an entire season, so overseers enforced strict discipline, often through violent means. Whippings, mutilation, and execution were not uncommon, creating an environment of constant fear and suffering. Workers had little autonomy, limited food, and inadequate shelter, and disease spread quickly among overcrowded living quarters. Families were frequently separated, with children sold or assigned to different plantations. Despite this oppressive system, resistance persisted. Enslaved Africans used both subtle and overt methods to defy their oppressors. Some worked slowly, feigning illness or sabotaging machinery to disrupt production. Others escaped to establish maroon communities in the forests or mountains, where they created autonomous settlements that preserved African cultural practices. These communities became both physical and symbolic spaces of defiance, maintaining language, religious rituals, and communal governance in the face of European control. Even within the plantation, enslaved people preserved cultural memory through song, oral storytelling, and clandestine spiritual practice, ensuring that their identity survived despite systemic attempts to erase it. Halfway across the world, in the highlands of present-day Bolivia, the silver mines of Potosi illustrate a different facet of colonial exploitation. Discovered in 1545, the Cerro Rico mountain was rich in silver, attracting Spanish colonial authorities eager to fuel European wealth and imperial ambitions. Mining conditions were horrific, particularly for the indigenous laborers conscripted through the MITA system, a forced labor draft derived from pre-Columbian practices, but massively intensified by the Spanish. Laborers endured freezing temperatures at high altitudes, treacherous shafts, and exposure to toxic mercury used in the refining process. Mortality rates were staggering. Some estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of indigenous workers died within decades of the mine's opening. Life in Potosi was a combination of extreme danger and relentless labor. Miners labored from dawn to dusk, often with minimal tools, while overseers enforced quotas with brutal discipline. Accidents were frequent, and ventilation was poor, leading to suffocation and respiratory disease. Mercury poisoning from refining silver caused neurological damage, illness, and death, adding to the already lethal conditions. Women and children were not spared. They participated in secondary labor, such as washing ore or supporting mining operations, and suffered equally from exposure, exhaustion, and systemic neglect. The wealth extracted from Potosi flowed directly to Spain and its European partners, funding military campaigns, palaces, and trade, while the human and environmental costs were largely ignored. Yet even in Potosi, resistance emerged. Miners occasionally sabotaged equipment, slowed work, or fled into surrounding mountains. Indigenous communities outside the mines maintained alternative agricultural and social structures, preserving cultural practices even as their populations were drawn into the labor draft. These acts of defiance, while often limited in scope due to the extreme coercion, represented persistent human agency in the face of systemic violence. Potosi became a symbol not only of European wealth, but of the extraordinary human suffering required to generate it, a stark illustration of the dark truth behind European expansion. Meanwhile, in the distant Moluccas, known as the Spice Islands, the European quest for cloves, nutmeg, and mace added another dimension to exploitation. Unlike the Americas, the focus here was on monopolizing trade rather than large-scale settlement, but the consequences for local populations were devastating. Portuguese and later Dutch forces sought to control production and export through fortified trading posts, military interventions, and coercive agreements with local rulers. When local communities resisted monopolistic demands, Europeans often responded with force. Villages were destroyed, populations enslaved or deported, and entire islands brought under European control. The spice trade illustrates the interconnection between commerce, coercion, and cultural disruption. The Portuguese, arriving first in the early 16th century, established fortified posts in Ambon and Ternate, dictating production quotas and exacting tribute. Failure to comply was met with violence, demonstrating that control of trade could be as lethal as territorial conquest. The Dutch, with the Dutch East India Company, intensified these systems, using private armies to enforce monopolies and prevent smuggling. Local resistance persisted in the form of rebellion, migration, or clandestine trade, but European control of maritime routes and military power largely dictated outcomes. These islands, once integrated into complex regional trade networks, became subordinated to European commercial imperatives, disrupting centuries of local economic and social organization. Across these case studies, the Caribbean, Potosi, and the Moluccas, a common pattern emerges. European expansion relied on a combination of labor exploitation, coercion, and technological advantage. Wealth and goods flowed outward to Europe, while human suffering, social disruption, and environmental transformation accumulated in the colonies. Yet resistance, adaptation, and cultural survival persisted. Enslaved Africans, indigenous laborers, and local communities found ways to assert agency, maintain traditions, and challenge domination, even under extreme oppression. These stories highlight the complexity of the age of exploration. It was not simply a narrative of European triumph, but a global system of exploitation and human resilience. These case studies also reveal the interdependence of different regions within the global system. Silver from Potosi fueled European purchases of spices in Asia. Sugar from the Caribbean relied on African labor. Profits from the spice trade funded further expansion into the Americas. The age of exploration was truly global in scope, linking continents, labor systems, and ecologies into a network that enriched Europe while devastating millions of lives. Life for enslaved Africans and indigenous laborers was structured around relentless labor, social control, and constant surveillance. On sugar plantations in the Caribbean, the daily routine began before dawn and extended well into the evening, dictated by the rhythms of the fields and the demands of the mills. Workers cleared land, cut cane, and transported heavy stalks to presses and boiling houses. The work was physically punishing, performed under tropical heat and often without adequate food or clothing. Accidents were common. Sugarcane knives, boiling sugar vats, and heavy logs claimed many lives. Those who fell behind or resisted were punished with whippings, mutilation, or, in extreme cases, execution. Families were frequently separated. Children were assigned to different tasks or sold to other plantations, eroding the social fabric of enslaved communities. Indigenous laborers in mines like Potosi experienced conditions no less severe. High altitudes, freezing night temperatures, and poorly ventilated shafts made mining a dangerous undertaking. Miners faced cave-ins, falls, and exposure to toxic mercury used in refining silver, which caused neurological damage, kidney failure, and often death. Labor was organized hierarchically. Indigenous men performed the heaviest extraction work. Women and children were conscripted for processing and support tasks, and overseers, often Europeans or mestizo elites, enforced quotas with violence. Entire communities were drawn into the META system, uprooting laborers from their villages and disrupting agricultural production, leading to famine and social dislocation in surrounding areas. Despite these conditions, enslaved and indigenous peoples found ways to resist and preserve elements of cultural identity. Resistance ranged from subtle to overt, from small acts of sabotage to organized rebellions. On plantations, workers might deliberately work slowly, damage equipment, or feign illness to delay production. In mines, workers sometimes refused particularly dangerous tasks or organized collective slowdowns. These acts of resistance, though often punished harshly, were strategies for survival and maintained a sense of agency in an otherwise controlled environment. Cultural survival was equally important. Enslaved Africans preserved religious, linguistic, and musical traditions, adapting them to new circumstances. In the Caribbean and the Americas, African-derived religions blended elements of Catholicism with ancestral spiritual practices, creating syncretic systems such as Vodou, Candomblé, and Santeria. These traditions allowed communities to maintain continuity with their heritage while navigating the demands of the colonial order. Music and oral storytelling were essential tools for maintaining memory, transmitting knowledge, and providing psychological relief. Songs often contained coded messages about escape, resistance, or historical memory, serving both spiritual and practical purposes. Indigenous peoples also employed strategies of cultural resilience. Even under forced labor, they maintained agricultural practices, cultivated traditional crops, and preserved knowledge of local ecosystems. Villages that had been partially depopulated or displaced often regrouped in remote areas, continuing communal rituals, ceremonies, and governance structures outside European oversight. Language preservation, storytelling, and the continuation of artisanal crafts were critical in sustaining identity. While Europeans sought to impose their own language, religion, and customs, indigenous and African populations adapted, negotiated, and sometimes subtly subverted these impositions. Rebellion and escape were more overt forms of resistance. Maroon communities, composed of escaped enslaved Africans and sometimes allied indigenous groups, emerged in the Caribbean, South America, and Central America. These settlements were often located in inaccessible forests, mountains, or swamps, making them difficult for colonial authorities to eradicate. Maroons created self-sustaining communities, cultivating food, maintaining cultural practices, and organizing militias to defend against European incursions. Their existence was a constant reminder to colonial powers that domination was never complete, and that enslaved and indigenous peoples retained the capacity for agency and autonomy. In Africa, resistance to European slaving practices took multiple forms. Coastal communities sometimes engaged in military action against slave raiders, while others sought to protect their populations by relocating or negotiating terms of trade that minimized harm. Some states leveraged European demand for slaves to consolidate internal power, controlling which populations were sold and which remained free. Even within the transatlantic slave trade, Africans maintained networks of communication and kinship that allowed cultural practices, spiritual systems, and social cohesion to survive despite the trauma of displacement. The psychological and social consequences of colonial oppression were profound. Enslaved and indigenous communities experienced trauma from family separation, violence, and forced labor, yet human ingenuity and resilience allowed them to navigate these pressures. Humor, storytelling, communal rituals, and spiritual practice became essential coping mechanisms. Knowledge of survival strategies, where to find food, how to evade punishment, how to maintain social cohesion, was passed down orally, ensuring continuity of community identity even under extreme oppression. Education and skill transmission were also subtle forms of resistance. Enslaved Africans often learned European languages, farming techniques, or trades, not solely to serve colonial masters, but to use these skills strategically for autonomy, escape, or community survival. Indigenous artisans and farmers adapted European tools to local conditions, combining knowledge systems to maintain productivity and cultural continuity. Even under strict surveillance, knowledge was preserved, transformed, and transmitted, ensuring that colonial domination could not fully erase these communities' histories. The intersection of labor, culture, and resistance highlights the complexity of the age of exploration. European expansion was not a story of unilateral conquest, but a contested process in which the colonized continually asserted agency, negotiated survival, and preserved identity. These dynamics complicate narratives of passive victimhood and underscore the resilience of those subjected to slavery, forced labor, and cultural domination. The wealth extracted from the Americas, Africa, and Asia was built upon these struggles, a fact that European narratives of progress often obscure. The experiences of daily life, resistance, and cultural survival also illuminate the interconnectedness of the global colonial system. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean depended on African labor. Silver from Potosi funded European purchases of spices and textiles from Asia. Profits from the spice trade helped finance further expansion into the Americas. Human suffering, environmental transformation, and economic extraction were interwoven across continents, creating a truly global system of exploitation. Yet, in every region, resistance and cultural survival demonstrated that this system was never absolute, and that human agency persisted in defiance of European power. As the centuries of European exploration and colonization unfolded, the consequences of these global encounters became increasingly complex, shaping societies, economies, and environments in ways that were both visible and subtle. The interconnected networks of trade, labor, and culture created by the age of exploration established the foundations of the modern world, but always at immense human cost. Wealth and technological advancements in Europe were inseparable from the forced labor, dispossession, and ecological devastation experienced by millions across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The demographic consequences alone were staggering. Indigenous populations in the Americas faced catastrophic declines due to disease, warfare, and forced labor. African populations were subjected to the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade, uprooted from their homelands, and dispersed across the Americas under brutal conditions. The displacement and suffering of these populations not only altered social structures, but also reshaped cultural landscapes. Communities that had thrived for centuries were fragmented, and traditional systems of governance, religion, and knowledge were disrupted or suppressed. Yet, within this trauma, survival persisted. Cultural practices, spiritual systems, and oral histories continued, sometimes blending with European traditions to form new hybrid identities that endure to this day. Economic systems established during the age of exploration left a lasting imprint on global structures. Colonial extraction, trade monopolies, and mercantilist policies generated immense wealth for Europe, fueling political power, urbanization, and military dominance. Meanwhile, the regions supplying labor, silver, sugar, and spices experienced economic patterns that were structured to serve European interests, often preventing local development and entrenching inequality. These disparities created global hierarchies of wealth and power that shaped interactions between nations for centuries, laying the groundwork for modern patterns of economic dependency and structural inequality. Environmental transformations also left deep, enduring legacies. The introduction of non-native crops and animals, the widespread cultivation of monocultures, and the extraction of mineral wealth reshaped ecosystems across continents. Forests were cleared, soils exhausted, waterways diverted, and native species displaced. The environmental consequences of the age of exploration were not localized, they were global. European demand for sugar, silver, and spices created ecological chains of cause and effect that altered landscapes and biomes, some of which persist centuries later. In essence, the human and environmental costs of exploration were inseparable. The reshaping of societies and the reshaping of nature occurred simultaneously, driven by the same pursuit of profit, power, and control. Cultural and social consequences also continued to resonate long after the initial waves of conquest. Language, religion, and governance were transformed across continents. European legal codes, missionary education, and colonial institutions imposed new norms, yet these impositions were never absolute. Indigenous and African populations adapted, preserved, and transformed cultural practices to survive under colonial pressures. Hybrid societies emerged, blending European, African, and indigenous elements in religion, music, cuisine, art, and social structures. These transformations demonstrate both the destructive power of colonial systems and the resilience of human creativity and identity. The age of exploration also created enduring global networks that continue to shape the modern world. Trade routes established between Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas facilitated the flow of goods, ideas, and labor in ways that accelerated globalization. However, these networks were deeply asymmetrical. The wealth and technological advancement of Europe were achieved at the expense of colonized peoples and environments, leaving a legacy of inequality that persists in economic, social, and political spheres. Understanding this asymmetry is crucial crucial for grasping the full historical impact of the age of exploration. At the same time, resistance and survival stories persisted, creating moral and historical counterpoints to European narratives of progress. Indigenous rebellions, African uprisings, maroon communities, and cultural preservation efforts served as enduring reminders that conquest was never total, and that human agency could survive even under extreme oppression. These acts of resilience complicate simplistic narratives of discovery and triumph, highlighting the ongoing tension between domination and resistance that defined the age of exploration. In this transitional phase toward the final summary, we can also reflect on the enduring symbolic and educational consequences of the age of exploration. Statues, textbooks, and public narratives have long glorified explorers and conquest, while minimizing or omitting the violence, exploitation, and environmental destruction that accompanied it. Contemporary debates over memory, commemoration, and curriculum reflect an ongoing reckoning with this history. Recognition of these darker truths is essential not only for historical accuracy, but also for understanding modern social inequalities, cultural hybridity, and environmental challenges. By examining the economic, social, cultural, and ecological legacies together, a fuller picture emerges. The age of exploration was a transformative period that reshaped the planet in every sense, yet it was fundamentally a story of exploitation and resilience. The wealth, knowledge, and interconnectedness that Europe gained came directly from the suffering, labor, and ingenuity of colonized peoples. Every silver coin, sugar loaf, and spice shipment carried with it human toil, cultural disruption, and environmental consequence. The age of exploration was a period of ambition, curiosity, and profound transformation. Yet beneath the familiar stories of discovery lies a far darker narrative. For centuries, European powers embarked on voyages across oceans, driven by the pursuit of wealth, spices, precious metals, and territorial dominance. The world became increasingly interconnected. Trade routes spanned continents, and wealth flowed toward Europe, fueling empires and shaping the modern global system. Yet this expansion was inseparable from violence, exploitation, and environmental upheaval. From the Caribbean sugar plantations to the silver mines of Potosi, and from the spice islands of Southeast Asia to the trading posts of Africa, the age of exploration relied on systems of coercion and forced labor that inflicted immense human suffering. Indigenous peoples were decimated by disease, warfare, and displacement. Enslaved Africans endured the horrors of the Middle Passage and grueling life on plantations and in mines. Families were torn apart, communities dismantled, and cultural practices suppressed. Even in the face of these horrors, however, resilience persisted. Resistance took many forms: armed uprisings, flight to maroon communities, subtle acts of sabotage, preservation of language, ritual, and storytelling, demonstrating that agency and survival endured despite the oppressive machinery of colonial systems. The environmental impact of this period was equally profound. The Columbian exchange spread crops, animals, and diseases across continents, transforming ecosystems and human societies alike. European introduced species disrupted native flora and fauna, plantations reshaped landscapes, and mining operations polluted rivers and soils. These ecological transformations were inseparable from economic extraction and labor exploitation, leaving legacies that persist in agriculture, biodiversity, and the structure of global economies to this day. The natural world was altered alongside human societies, underscoring that the age of exploration reshaped the entire planet, not only politically and socially, but environmentally as well. Cultural transformations also emerged from this era, though often born of necessity and survival. African, indigenous, and mixed populations blended traditions, adapted practices, and preserved knowledge in ways that ensured identity persisted under conditions of extreme oppression. Languages, religious practices, music, and cuisine evolved, creating hybrid cultures that remain visible across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. At the same time, European narratives glorified conquest and minimized suffering, shaping public memory in ways that continue to influence perceptions of history. Recognizing the fuller truth, including the suffering, resistance, and resilience, is essential to understanding the real impact of this period. Economically, the age of exploration established patterns of global inequality and dependency. The wealth and technological advancements that fueled European dominance were extracted at tremendous human cost, leaving colonies and their peoples positioned in subordinate roles within global trade networks. These disparities, rooted in centuries of exploitation, continue to shape patterns of economic development, social hierarchy, and international relations today. The consequences of the age of exploration are therefore not confined to history. They are lived realities that inform the structure of the modern world. Ultimately, the age of exploration was not simply a tale of curiosity, discovery, or adventure. It was a story of ambition entwined with violence, innovation intertwined with oppression, and human ingenuity shadowed by profound suffering. It reshaped continents, peoples, and ecosystems, leaving behind legacies of inequality, resilience, and cultural transformation. Understanding this history requires acknowledging both the achievements and the immense costs, recognizing that the same processes that connected the world also inflicted staggering harm on millions of lives. As we reflect on this era, it becomes clear that the stories of conquest, labor, resistance, and survival are inseparable. The European empires gained wealth and power, but it was built upon the toil, creativity, and resilience of those they sought to dominate. Indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and colonized communities resisted, adapted, and preserved their identities, shaping the very foundations of the modern world even under oppression. The dark truth behind the age of exploration is therefore a story of human suffering, resilience, environmental change, and the enduring consequences of global ambition. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most complex and consequential periods. If you found this exploration insightful, make sure to subscribe for more long-form history videos, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive, and sharing this video helps more people uncover the hidden histories that have shaped our world. History is not just about the past, it's about understanding the present and shaping a better future. Thank you again for joining this journey, and stay curious.